My son-in-law shoved my wife off the front porch steps, and when she hit the concrete driveway below and cried out, he laughed. Not a startled, involuntary laugh, the kind that escapes when something goes exactly the way you intended it to go. I did not lunge at him. I did not grab him by the collar of that $2,000 jacket. I walked down those 3 steps with a steady hand, knelt beside my wife of 41 years, and dialed 911 without my voice shaking once. My second call was to my attorney, Christine Halsey, and it was 5 words. It's time. Run the sequence. Less than 36 hours later, my son-in-law Brent Holloway's brokerage license was suspended. His firm had lost $11 million in client referrals overnight, and the building where he held court every morning had belonged to me for 11 years. He never knew I was the one who had quietly built a cage around his entire existence. Not until I sat across from him at my dining room table and told him so myself. Before I get into exactly how I dismantled the career and the marriage of the man who spent 4 years trying to steal my family, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you've ever had to stay completely silent while someone badly underestimated you, hit that like button, because that is exactly what this story is about. My name is Lawrence. I'm 67 years old, I live outside Nashville, Tennessee, and I drive an 8-year-old Buick that I maintain myself. I have a vegetable garden in the backyard that produces more tomatoes every August than Helen and I could ever use. I shop at the same grocery store I've shopped at for 20 years, and the checkout cashiers know me by name. Brent knew all of that, and he thought he knew everything there was to know. What he didn't know, what very few people knew, was that the word retired, in my case, meant I had spent 30 years building a regional insurance brokerage network, grown it to 42 agencies across 4 states, and sold the entire enterprise to a national carrier for a number large enough to require a team of accountants and a quietly structured holding company to manage it properly. My wife Helen had been absolutely clear. She had no interest in being known as a wealthy woman. We kept the house we raised our daughter Amy in. We drove reasonable cars. We gave to causes that mattered to us without putting our names on anything. And a portion of what I had built went into commercial real estate, held through an LLC called Ridgemont Commercial Properties, a name with no obvious connection to me. I had always believed that men who shout about their money are usually afraid of losing it. The quieter the man, the more he tends to actually have. I liked the invisibility. I had earned it. Brent Holloway was 39 years old and a financial advisor at a boutique wealth management firm in downtown Nashville. He had married my daughter Amy 4 years ago last March in a ceremony he insisted on making larger and more expensive than she wanted. He drove a leased Range Rover, wore suits that cost more than my first car, and talked about the market with the absolute confidence of someone who had never fully reckoned with being wrong. Amy was 38, a hospital administrator, careful and practical in the way of people who have organized complicated things under pressure for a long time. She was funny in that quiet way that sneaks up on you. She deserved better. I knew what Brent was from the first dinner he attended at our house. I watched how he sat at the table, how he cut off whatever she was saying before she finished, how he spent money they clearly didn't have and framed it as vision. I watched him narrow her world gradually, her friends, her schedule, her opinions, until everything was arranged around his preferences and comfort. I watched the calculation that lived just behind her eyes when she talked about him. That constant, exhausting calculation of what was safe to say. I said nothing. She loved him. I kept watching. About 6 months before Easter, Brent discovered my wife's knee. Helen had minor knee surgery the previous fall and still walked with a slight limp on cold mornings. That limp became Brent's favorite instrument. He mentioned it every time we were together. Helen was slowing down. She seemed confused sometimes. She was a real fall risk. He delivered each observation with tremendous concern layered into his voice, the kind of concern you can hear a person practicing. He was building something with those words, brick by brick, and I understood precisely what he was building before he ever opened a folder. He was building a case for incompetence. Easter Sunday, Helen spent 2 days cooking. Ham, scalloped potatoes, green bean casserole, a lemon pound cake that had been her mother's recipe. The house smelled the way a house is supposed to smell when a family gathers in it. Brent arrived 40 minutes late and walked in mid-conversation on his cell phone, not acknowledging either of us until he ended the call at my kitchen table. He sat down, served himself the largest portion of ham before I had even picked up the fork, and began his performance. He talked about his performance numbers. He talked about a conference in Atlanta where he had apparently outclassed every other person in the room. He talked about a client he had personally saved from a devastating financial mistake, and he described the client's gratitude in detail, as if he were reading from a testimonial he had written about himself. Amy listened with a careful frozen expression that I recognized. Helen asked polite questions. I cut my food slowly and listened to the full structure of his self-invention. Then he set his fork down, looked at me across my own table, and smiled. Lawrence, he said, I've been meaning to talk to you about a real opportunity. I told him I was listening. He explained that his firm was putting together a private investment fund, a select offering for aligned family investors, he called it. Minimum buy-in was $150,000. He told me that whatever Helen and I had sitting in retirement accounts was almost certainly underperforming in the current rate environment, that conservative mutual funds were a slow bleed, and that he could personally guarantee a strong return if I moved a portion of our savings over before the offering closed. He wasn't asking. He was issuing an instruction to someone he was certain couldn't say no to him. I looked at him calmly and said that Helen and I appreciated the thought, but that we were comfortable with our current approach and preferred not to make changes. The smile went out like a light. He made 2 more passes at it over the course of the meal. Each time I declined, same voice, same tone. Each refusal sent a small visible shock through him, the way you'd react if a piece of furniture spoke back to you. After dessert, he watched Helen carry a stack of plates to the kitchen and shook his head. Has she been evaluated? He said, not to her, to the room. Formally, there are cognitive and motor assessments. If we're going to start talking about managing things responsibly, we need a baseline. She's carrying dishes, Brent, Amy said quietly. I'm being realistic, he said. Someone at this table has to be. I didn't respond. I let the silence sit between us and watched him fill it. He talked for several minutes about elder care resources, about the wisdom of establishing power of attorney while both parties were still fully competent, about the dangers of delaying the hard conversations. He was very, very interested in our legal documents. We walked them to the car just after 7. The evening had turned cool in that particular way, April evenings do in Tennessee grass and distant rain. Helen went back inside for her sweater. I stood on the porch with Amy, while Brent walked to the driveway with his phone. Helen came out through the front door carrying her sweater and a small folding umbrella. Brent had mentioned earlier that he might have left one in our car, and she was going to check. She moved down the 3 porch steps the way she always did, one hand light on the railing. I watched Brent see her coming. He put his phone in his pocket. He walked back toward the steps. I watched him calculate something in a fraction of a second, watched the decision move across his face and disappear into his expression before anyone else might have caught it. He moved toward her, under the guise of helping, positioning himself at the base of the steps as if to offer a hand. Then he turned sharply, the way a person turns when they are pretending not to see someone directly in front of them. His shoulder dropped and his elbow swung back and caught my wife of 41 years hard on the side of her shoulder. She had no way to brace herself, both hands occupied, one foot in the air on that last step. The force of it spun her sideways, and she fell the full distance off the bottom step, landing hard on her hip and outstretched palm, her head catching the corner of the brick landscaping border that runs along the edge of our front path. She made a sound I will not try to describe here. Amy shrieked and ran down the steps. I moved behind her controlled, because I needed every part of myself to be controlled for what came next. Brent stood over my wife where she lay on the concrete, and he laughed. A short, satisfied exhale through his nose, the sound of a man who got what he was after. Then he spread his hands in front of him like a man presenting evidence and said, in a voice rounded with performance, "This is what I have been trying to tell all of you. She cannot safely navigate 3 steps. She is a hazard to herself and to this household. You cannot keep pretending this isn't happening." Amy was already on her knees, with her hands pressed against the cut on Helen's head, crying and telling her not to move. I walked down the steps. I knelt beside my wife. I touched her cheek with 2 fingers and told her I was right there and that help was coming. I pulled my phone from my shirt pocket. My hands were perfectly still. I called 911, gave them our address, described Helen's injuries clearly and accurately, and ended the call. I looked at Brent for exactly 2 seconds. He was straightening the cuffs of his jacket. I opened my contacts, found Christine Halsey, and called her. She answered on the second ring. "It's time," I said. "Run the sequence." She didn't ask one question. "Done," she said. "By morning." I put the phone in my pocket and turned my attention back to my wife. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. Brent positioned himself in front of the paramedics before they reached Helen and delivered an excellent performance. Concerned, fluent, appropriately grave. He told them she had been declining for months, that the family had been discussing her care options, that tonight's fall was really an extension of an ongoing problem with her balance and coordination. He said all of this loudly enough that every neighbor within view could hear it clearly. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who had been rehearsing it for weeks. I answered the paramedics' direct questions and said nothing else. The hospital confirmed a mild concussion, a bruised hip, and a laceration above the ear that required 4 stitches. They kept her overnight. I sat beside her in the chair and held her hand until she fell asleep, and then I walked to find the water fountain. I turned down the wrong corridor and came within 10 feet of walking straight into Brent and Amy, standing in the fluorescent light outside the family waiting room. I pressed back against the cinder block wall before either of them saw me. Brent was holding a folded document against Amy's chest, talking close to her face in a low, urgent voice. He said that tonight had made everything obvious. He said that delaying any further was irresponsible. He said he'd had the paperwork drawn up weeks ago. A durable power of attorney for both medical decisions and financial assets, with Amy named as agent. He told her to go back in there and put the paper in front of me while I was exhausted, while my defenses were down, while I couldn't summon the stubbornness I usually had. "We need his signature tonight, Amy," he said. "Tell him it'll take the weight off. Tell him you want to help carry this. Don't let him redirect." Amy said nothing. She was staring at the document in her hands. "The fun close date is in 3 weeks," he said. There it was. I turned and walked back the way I came. I sat beside Helen in the dimmed room and felt something settle behind my sternum, cold and clear and absolute. Not the anger. I had set the anger aside, locked it somewhere secure and unlit. This was something else. The understanding that the trip on my front porch had not been a spontaneous act of cruelty. He had arrived at my house on Easter Sunday with those papers already folded in his jacket pocket. Every word he had said about Helen's decline for the past 6 months had been preparation. Every suggestion about assisted living and power of attorney had been scaffolding for a structure he had been building all along. He looked at my wife's frailty, her limp, her arthritis, the slight tremor in her hands in cold weather, and saw a tool he had used it. Around 11 o'clock I went back to the waiting room. I changed how I was walking, shoulders forward, feet dragging half an inch. I sank into the chair beside Amy like a man whose body had finally stopped cooperating. Brent looked at me with the alert, watchful expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen. I told him I had been sitting out in the parking lot doing a lot of thinking. I told him I had been too proud about all of this. I said that watching Helen fall tonight had cut through something in me that I hadn't been able to get around before, that we were slowing down, that the house and the finances and all of it were becoming more than I could carry alone. He went completely still. I said that if he and Amy had paperwork ready, I thought it might be time to stop fighting the inevitable. I told him I just wanted her to be safe. I said if he was willing to take the wheel on some of this, maybe I should let him. He put his hand on my knee. He called me buddy. He told me I was making the mature decision, the responsible decision, that I had nothing more to worry about. I looked at the floor and said, "Thank you." Then I closed my eyes and let the predator across from me believe he had finally won, while Christine Halsey, 12 miles away in her downtown office, was running the sequence that would end his career before sunrise. Christine had been my attorney for 19 years. She had spent time as a federal court clerk and 3 years at the SEC before she made partner. She was not a person who moved slowly or left gaps. When I came back from the sale of the brokerage network, I asked her to build a system that protected everything we had, and to build it so it could be activated quickly if it ever became necessary. She spent 4 months on it. When Brent's maneuvering became clear 6 months ago, I called her and told her to have the sequence ready. She had been patient since then, the way professionals who are very good at what they do know how to be patient. By 2 in the morning, she had filed an emergency complaint with FINRA, the financial industry regulatory authority that governs and licenses brokers. and attached 11 weeks of documentation showing that Brent had been diverting client fee income to cover personal expenses, lease payments on the Range Rover, a home renovation project, golf club dues charged to client development accounts that had no corresponding client contact records. She had been quietly assembling and cross-referencing his expense reports against firm billing records for months. A complaint to FINRA with supporting transaction records triggers automatic preliminary review. For a complaint of this severity, that process can move to interim suspension of trading privileges within hours. By 4 a.m, Brent Holloway's broker license status showed under review, activity suspended pending investigation. At the same time, Christine sent formal notice to the managing partner of Brent's firm. The letter stated that the anonymous referring party behind $11 million in assets currently managed by the firm was immediately withdrawing all referred client relationships, effective upon receipt, due to serious concerns about the professional conduct of a specific advisor. She did not name me in the letter. She didn't need to. The managing partner had known for 2 years that the anonymous referral relationship had a person behind it. By 5 a.m, she knew whose person it was. The third element involved the building. Brent's firm occupied the 6th floor of a 7-story building on Church Street in downtown Nashville. The building was owned by Ridgemont Commercial Properties, LLC. Christine contacted my property management company and issued a notice of material lease violation. The firm had been previously cited for unauthorized use of the building's common areas for client events and indicated that access to the premises was suspended pending a compliance meeting with legal counsel present. The building manager arrived at 6:40 in the morning and changed the access codes on every entry point in the building. There was one additional piece Christine executed that I had asked her to prepare 6 weeks earlier, when it became fully clear to me what Brent was planning for my family. She had been working quietly with a family law attorney to prepare a complete divorce filing on Amy's behalf. She had documented every financial account and asset in the marriage. She had noted that every joint account in the marriage was held under Amy's social security number, making her the primary account holder on all of them. At 6:30 in the morning, Christine called Amy. I had arranged it the night before. In the 7 minutes, I slipped outside the hospital, while Brent was texting his business associate from the waiting room. Amy didn't call me back that morning. She just started moving. Helen was discharged at 10 o'clock. She moved carefully, but her eyes were clear and her mind was entirely itself. In the car on the way home, she put her hand over mine on the gear shift. "I know what you did last night, Lawrence," she said. I told her I knew she did. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He won't ever come back into our home." I told her he wouldn't need to. He was going to come to us. We were right about that. I heard the Range Rover before I saw it. He came around our street too fast and braked hard in our driveway just before noon. He was out of the vehicle before the engine had fully stopped, his jacket wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his face the color of something left in the cold too long. I opened the front door before he could knock. He pushed past me talking, the words flooding out of him in a frantic torrent. He told me there had been a mistake at FINRA, a clerical error, a misunderstanding with his firm's building management, an inexplicable freeze on his client accounts. He needed $60,000 immediately to retain a securities attorney and get everything back to normal within the week. He promised he would double whatever I gave him once it was sorted. It was temporary. It was obviously a system error. This parasite stood in my foyer, pleading at me in the voice of a man who still believed he was managing the situation. I turned my back on him and walked toward the dining room. He followed me, because he had no other direction to go. What he found when he rounded the corner was not the broken old man he had been counting on. My wife Helen sat at the dining room table with her hands folded on the surface and her eyes level on him, not fragile, not declining, not confused. A woman of 65 had survived a deliberate assault on her own driveway and was sitting upright in her own home, looking at the man who did it with something beyond contempt, something past anger. The absolute dignity of someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to fear. My daughter Amy sat to Helen's right, her spine straight, her face arranged into the expression of a person who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. Christine Halsey sat at the head of the table in a charcoal blazer, with 2 accordion folders in front of her, and the expression of a professional who has done this before and found it well within her capabilities. Brent's voice stopped working. Christine introduced herself by name and explained her role. She did it pleasantly, the way you tell someone the temperature outside. Brent turned to me and told me this was impossible. He said I was a retired insurance man. He said the whole thing was some kind of mistake or theater or bluff. He said this with real conviction, which tells you everything you need to know about how little attention he had paid. I gestured to the empty chair across from Christine. She opened the first folder and slid a single sheet across the table. The state LLC registration document for Ridgemont Commercial Properties, with my signature on the formation line. The building where he had worked, where he had swaggered in every morning, where he had held client meetings and projected the image of a successful man. I had owned the walls around him for over a decade. She slid a second document, the referral arrangement that had directed $11 million in assets to his firm over the past 3 years. My name, legitimately disclosed to the firm's compliance officer at the time of inception under a professional structure Christine had built specifically for that purpose. She opened the second folder and turned it to face him. 41 pages, tabbed, highlighted. Every personal expense diverted from client fee income over an 18-month period. The vehicle, the renovation, the restaurant charges categorized as client development that had no matching client records. Every item cross-referenced with his own applications and statements. This fraud sat and read, while the color drained from his face one layer at a time. When Christine finished, she folded her hands and the room was quiet. Brent looked at Amy. He said her name like a man pulling at a rope. Amy reached into the bag beside her chair, placed a document on the table, and slid it toward him without letting it leave her fingertips until it reached him. Divorce petition, she said. No fault. All accounts, all assets. You leave with the Range Rover because it's in your name. You take your clothes. A pause. You can have the espresso machine. He looked at her. He said she wouldn't do this. Amy said, I already did. He turned to me then. He was looking for the tired old man from the hospital chair. The one who had finally bent under the weight of everything. He couldn't find that person, because that person had never been real. I told him he had 2 options. Option 1, he contested everything, the FINRA complaint, the lease, the divorce. Christine would proceed with a civil filing for financial manipulation of vulnerable adults, recognized under Tennessee law, with damages structured to follow him past any personal bankruptcy. The criminal referral for the deliberate assault on my wife, documented on a security camera mounted inside the porch fixture above our garage door. A camera he had walked past 4 years of Sunday dinners without ever noticing, would go to the district attorney's office by end of business. I let that settle. Option 2, he signed the divorce agreement and the client file return agreement, and he drove himself to the FINRA field office, where investigators were expecting him at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Christine had already arranged the meeting. In exchange, she would not push for criminal prosecution on the assault and would not add the elder financial exploitation filing to the complaint record. He would lose his license, his income, and his marriage, but he would not be prosecuted. I told him he had 5 minutes. He asked to speak to Amy in private. Amy said no. He asked if there was any point of negotiation. Christine said there was not. He sat for a long moment, a man who had built his entire life on leverage, realizing he had none. He picked up the pen and signed the divorce agreement, the client file agreement, and the confirmation of the 2 o'clock meeting. When he put the pen down the last time, the slight click of it against the table was the only sound in the room. I walked to the front door and opened it. He moved down the hallway without looking back at any of us. I watched through the living room window as he walked to the Range Rover, the one thing he was leaving with. He got in. He pulled slowly out of my driveway and drove away at the speed of a man who has had everything taken from him and is finally beginning to understand why. Christine texted me at 2:17 that afternoon. He had walked into the FINRA field office, presented his identification, and answered their questions. His license was formally suspended 60 days later, pending a disciplinary hearing. His firm terminated his employment before the end of the week. The weeks that followed were quiet, in the way a house becomes quiet when something loud and restless has finally moved out of it permanently. Amy stayed with us for 3 weeks. She slept in her old bedroom with the same curtains she chose when she was 16. She and Helen spent mornings at the kitchen table, sometimes talking and sometimes just occupying the same space. And I watched my daughter, remember who she was before 4 years of someone else's voice had been telling her who she wasn't. She went back to her career, her accounts, and her name, and she moved forward with the steadiness of a person who has stopped carrying dead weight. Helen's hip healed on schedule. The stitches came out clean. She walked the neighborhood on Thursday mornings, the same way she always had. Her pace, her route, on her own terms. On an evening in early May, Helen and I sat on the front porch after supper. The air smelled like honeysuckle and someone's lawnmower 2 houses down. The driveway below was just concrete and a crack I kept meaning to patch. Nothing heavy about it anymore. Helen said, "He really thought you were just some old man in a Buick." I said that was his choice to make and mine to use. She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and easy, the best sound that Porch had heard in a long time. I have never believed in making enemies, but I believe without any uncertainty that cruelty accumulates interest. Brent Holloway borrowed against a family that had offered him nothing but welcome, and he spent 4 years buying a life he hadn't earned with resources that were never his. He assumed the people holding those resources were too old, too worn down, and too devoted to their daughter's happiness to ever call the debt due. He was wrong on every count. Here is what I want you to take from this if you take one thing. Quiet is not the same as weak. Patience is not the same as surrender. And the most dangerous person in any room is very rarely the loudest one. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you've ever had to hold your ground without raising your voice, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, and tell me your story.